a flag, or ancient Egypt had a flag, or there was some flag used by the Ming dynasty in China that was every bit as common and familiar in that society as the stars and stripes are in the modern United States. Often these flag fetishists do this by seizing upon some banner or something that was maybe used to decorate a king's throne room at some point, and then they're like, aha, we have discovered the official flag of ancient Mesopotamia, or whatever. You see this a lot with the country ball people in particular, where the entire premise of these memes just takes for granted the idea that national flags have been around forever. But no, national flags are actually quite new, and a lot of our contemporary obsession with them is just a symptom of our equally modern obsession with categorizing and sorting absolutely everything into these very neat and tidy columns. Which leads me to complaint number 2. A flag is not necessarily the most useful symbol of a country. Now clearly there are many times where you might want to represent a country with a simple and efficient symbol, either to save space or just add some style. But flags aren't the only symbols that can serve this function, and I don't even think they should necessarily be the first thing we reach for. As tools of communication, flags have a lot of serious limitations. They change a lot, they are often very obscure, or as we just mentioned, non-existent, and of course a lot of them are very similar to one another. Take my own country of Canada, for example. As most flagsperts will know, Canada's maple leaf flag was only adopted in 1965, and before then this rather undistinguished flag was used for a period of time in the early to mid 20th century. But that flag also went through a lot of changes, and for much of Canadian history it would have been just as common to see the Union Jack treated as the flag of Canada, particularly in the 19th century. So given the fluidity of Canadian flag culture over the last 150 years, would a flag really be the best symbol to represent Canada if you were to, say, make a series of charts comparing the different populations of various countries over time? Or what if we were to, say, attempt to do the same thing with Germany? When people make charts or infographics or animations about historical stuff these days, I notice that a lot of designers will often get really fussy about using the precise, historically correct flag to represent countries at the precise moment they're being talked about, regardless of how obscure that flag might be to their audience or even to people of that country at that time. The clarity of communication is being lost in favor of an obsession with flag trivia. I think we should perhaps be a little bit more open-minded about using alternative symbols of countries that are perhaps a little bit more timeless and recognizable. For example, check out this ad I found the other day in an old magazine from the 1930s. It is a car company bragging about all of the different international awards that they've won in different countries around the world. And you can see that other than for the UK, they don't use flags to represent these different countries, but rather stylized symbols like a kangaroo for Australia or a sphinx for Egypt. I quite like this because even though this ad is 90 years old, it feels less dated than it would have if they had gone with the flag approach. I've similarly always liked how in the board game Axis and Allies, they use Air Force roundels as the tokens of the different countries. I think they're pretty recognizable as national symbols, even if you're not super into military stuff. But that said, it does have to be acknowledged that there will always be some countries that just can't be reduced to a symbol, usually because they're just not that very well known to much of the world. Sometimes the only symbol worth using is just the place's name, or at the very least an abbreviation of it. That might not be much fun, but sometimes there's no real alternative. I mean, even the Olympics can't escape this. Whenever they put those little flag graphics on the TV, they'll usually have to put a few letters beside them as well, because they just can't take it for granted that the audience knows what, say, the flag of Lithuania looks like. So yeah, let's not overstate a flag's usefulness. We still have a long way to go before flags, and especially historical flags, are part of any universal human language, so it's often worth thinking twice before using them to communicate. Complaint number 3. Not every place has the same relationship with its flag. In my experience, a lot of flag nerds tend to come from this continent, a place with a pretty unique flag culture. Americans and Canadians tend to view our flags as objects of the mass popular culture. So not only can anyone buy our flags very easily in all sorts of different forms, but our flags are also commonly used in logos and patterns and cartoons and so on. I don't think that any of this is necessarily bad. We tend to get shamed a lot for treating our flags in an excessively casual way, but that's just part of our culture and it seems to work fine for us. But that said, it is important to realize that we can get into some problems when we assume that this playful attitude towards flags is somehow universal, because it very often is not. And I don't just mean in the sense that we go further than other countries. I mean in the sense that there are many countries in this world where it would simply not occur to them to partake in any of our flag traditions because their entire concept of what the flag is for is completely different. For example, in Saudi Arabia, their flag has a fancy calligraphy version of the statement of the faith on it. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. This gives their flag a religious significance that in turn imposes all sorts of special protocols on how it should be used, which is to say, rarely and with great veneration. I remember a while ago FIFA wanted to make a special World Cup soccer ball with all of the different countries' flags on it, but the Saudis said no because they didn't want people kicking the name of the Lord with their dirty shoes. In countries like Spain and Germany, meanwhile, being too into the flag is associated with the excessive nationalism of their previous fascist governments. This means that even displaying the flag in a way that we might consider relatively restrained or tasteful would be regarded quite differently over there. Perhaps you've seen the famous video of Merkel angrily pulling the flag out of the guy's hand. It can sometimes be a little bit confusing because even some of these countries still love to wave their flags like crazy during soccer games. But this simply reflects this whole other norm that some places have, wherein sport culture is understood as being this completely distinct thing from normal culture, with accordingly different standards of acceptable behavior. And then there are places like India, which until quite recently had laws in place that said the flag could only be used by the government, meaning there has never been quite the same sense of public ownership of the flag as we have on this continent. This is often the case in undemocratic states as well, where the government jealously controls all symbols of patriotism, which is why flags are often changed when undemocratic regimes are overthrown, because the public never felt all that connected to them in the first place. I think one of the reasons why we get a bit confused about this over here is because immigrants to this part of the world often use their old country's flags in a way they wouldn't necessarily back home, like as a logo on a restaurant or a symbol of cultural pride. But this is often just an example of immigrants assimilating into our culture and our flag traditions, rather than necessarily a reflective example of how they might treat their flag back home. Presuming the existence of a universal flag culture gets into some of the same problems we talked about earlier in assuming that every country has always had a flag. It encourages us to overlook important distinctions in the evolutions and traditions of patriotism and symbolism around the world, which are often tremendously interesting to research precisely because they defy our own cultural expectations. Okay, final complaint. People are getting way too literal-minded about flag design. So I came across this flag the other day, which purported to be a truly inclusive flag for pride. In addition to the traditional rainbow stripes, we also have the trans stripes and then a black and brown gradient to acknowledge the diverse array of people of color. These purple stripes up here represent other traditionally marginalized communities, and then this umbrella represents the sex worker community. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of all of this, but I do think that to most people, this would come off as something that is very cluttered and not particularly attractive. It can only really be justified if you have this extremely literal sense of how a flag should go about doing its job of representing a community. The literalists would say that since a flag is a visual medium, a flag's design must therefore be as visually complicated as the community it represents. And since the LGBTQ+ community is very complex, so must their flag be. Another example would be how every so often you hear about someone proposing we update the Union Jack in one way or another to stick in more colors or new symbols to correct for some perceived deficiency in its ability to accurately reflect the full diversity of the United Kingdom. It is again a very literal mentality that discourages people from engaging with an abstract shape with a more abstract way of thinking. The more abstract mindset would be like, look, this is the flag of France. France is the country where we all live, and therefore this is a symbol we should understand as representing the full diversity of the French people without it necessarily having to explicitly spell out why. Like, obviously, French people come in all sorts of different colors, but the flag itself doesn't have to come in all of those colors any more than the flag has to come in all different sizes because French people come in all different sizes. The flag is just a symbol of a construct of the mind, sort of like the letter A or the number 1. At some point, you just have to be able to use your imagination a bit. Now, obviously, this is not to say that some flags cannot be explicitly designed to contain imagery that is deliberately intended to exclude people from imagining themselves as part of the society. We can think of the old Mississippi flag, which had a Confederate cross, which was added in 1894 under